Hi, I'm Talia Baroncelli, and you're watching theAnalysis-news. You're watching part 2 of my in-depth discussion with political economist Patrick Bond on the BRICS countries. If you haven't watched part 1, I'd recommend that you do that one first so that there's more continuity and then come back to us here. We really rely on your contributions to make this content, so it would be great if you could make a small contribution by going to our website, theAnalysis.news, and hitting the donate button at the top right corner of the screen. We really appreciate all of your contributions. You can also get onto our mailing list via our website, theAnalysis.news, and like and subscribe to our podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts, whether that be on Spotify or Apple, or even on our YouTube channel, theAnalysis-news. Make sure when you're on YouTube, you hit the bell. That way you're notified every time there's a new episode. See you in a bit with Patrick Bond for part 2. Joining me now is Patrick Bond. He's a political economist and professor of sociology at the University of Johannesburg. He directs the Center for Social Change. He's also the author of numerous books, including BRICS, an anti-capitalist critique, which he wrote together with Anna Garcia. It's really great to have you here today, Patrick.
Thanks for the chat, Talia. Good.
Well, at the beginning of the interview, you were speaking about Samir Amin, and he's a theorist on uneven development. So I think it would be the right time to speak about a capitalist critique and political economy theory right now, since we're talking about transfers of wealth from the global south to the global north, the creation of global value chains. And I know your work has been incredibly influenced by political economist David Harvey. And David Harvey, in his book, The New Imperialism, speaks about accumulation by dispossession. And when capitalism essentially goes into overdrive because it can't find new territory to extract resources from, it essentially puts a lot of pressure on the people who are suffering from these value transfers and from the extraction of resources, and capital has nowhere to go in those instances. So maybe you can use this analysis right now to explain what's happened with integration of countries in the global south into the global economy in the 70s and the 80s, where they were, absorbed into the economy and then eventually also creators of surplus, but then this capital had nowhere else to go and there was increasing dispossession. So I think it would be the right moment to speak about how these theories actually play out in real life.
Well, it's always great to be able to kind of review the evidence and then see where you may need theoretical framing, because you've done it very well. The earliest of the, I think, theorists that described imperialism at the time, particularly using colonial power, was Rosa Luxemburg, who in 1910, in The Accumulation of Capital, really found that the surplus transfer was capital meeting the non-capitalists. Now, there were other theories of imperialism because Europe was in chaos, and Vladimir Lenin wrote a great pamphlet in 1916 about the inter-imperial rivalries, and others like Bukharin and Hilferding, they drew on John Hobson. That many of these important early 20th century theorists could identify that if you run out of space for your capitalist class, well, they're going to need their colonial hinterland, and then they're going to get into conflicts over how that occurs. But I think it was Luxemburg framing it as capital against the non-capitalists, against traditional societies, against nature by depleting non-renewable resources, or against matriarchal systems, or against states that were emerging, which we now know is a sort of process of privatization. And David Harvey's The Accumulation of Capital and Disclosure, he was my doctoral advisor, picks that up and brings it up to the 21st century, in which, as you say, we've seen this sort of layer emerge. Emanuel Wallerstein calling it a semi-periphery, because it's not really in the South. These are particularly in the 60s and 70s, when these theories were emerging. You could see the U.S. having client states in Israel or Saudi Arabia or Turkey, or in the Middle East, Iran at that time before 1980, or Brazil, and some of the Latin American countries that had coups that were organized or supported by the U.S., and similarly in Asia. Now, the main point about that layer is that even in the 70s, when new industrialized countries were coming up, and then China in the 90s with its liberalization, they became attractive as sites for Western multinational capital. And the value chain you mentioned, in which the dirty work of picking out the raw materials from Africa gets done by Chinese companies who put the products together in their big factories in the east coast of China and then sell to the West, makes the amplification of the exploitations and this unequal ecological exchange much worse, because the Chinese firms, as far as I've seen them operate, are much harder to contest. They're much more repressive and ruthless. But we don't have the systems, for example, of corporate social responsibility or filing lawsuits that we would have if we were fighting a U.S. company or British, especially British companies or German companies. Now, these are the kind of dilemmas we have in looking at the BRICS layer of companies, because they're, let's say, if you use a Marxist framing of overaccumulation tendencies, they overproduce. Like the West, China is the most overproductive with roughly 30% overcapacity in most of their main industrial sectors. Well, they do need to, as they're putting it, they need to go out. The spatial fix, they need to move. The Belt and Road Initiative was the vehicle for that. And that means they run into the kind of terrain of poor countries. Maybe most spectacularly, we saw Sri Lanka default, unable to pay China and then having to turn over a port to Chinese management. Now, the dilemma is that when you move out these processes, you're not getting a new kind of infrastructure. You're really still under those sorts of pressures, getting neo-colonial systems. And so the theoretical forces of extractivist capitalism, accumulation by dispossession, are actually being amplified by the BRICS companies. And that's one of the most dangerous things when we look at here in South Africa, the kind of BRICS infrastructure. It's at the moment, and the BRICS New Development Bank is part of this, aimed at exporting coal and Chinese locomotives, which ended up also in a corrupt relationship, or the special economic zones that China had been very active in. These all reflect at a deeper theoretical level some of the capitalists in the world being exuberantly extractivist and super exploitative. And unfortunately, although of course the Western companies are there, the big oil companies are certainly all around Africa, it's the Chinese and Indian and Brazilian, and we get Russian Wagner Group as part of that, and of course the South African, that are doing some of the worst damage in Africa. And it's that, let's call it a sort of exhaustion of the various possibilities that capital's always explored to have a spatial fix, to move the problem around, have a temporal fix, which is to use finance to pay later while you consume now using the credit system, and now accumulation by dispossession, what we would call the shifting of the problem, the stalling of the problem through finance and credit, and the stealing. Those management techniques for capitalist crisis then run out. And then you're going to start seeing kind of military conflicts logically emerge as logics of territorial conflict take center stage. And the internecine battles between capitalists then reach the point where it looks like 1914 all over again.
And how do you differentiate between the sub-imperialism you've been speaking about, how that's reflected in the BRICS, and what's called inter-imperialisms within this capitalist system? Is there much of a difference between the two? Is it just a theoretical term, or would you say it's substantially different?
Yeah, it could be semantic at one level, which is where I see a lot of comrades who are sort of worried about the Russian invasion. And for some, like Boris Kagarlitsky in jail in Russia, the logic of Putin's invasion was his own legitimacy crisis at home. I've seen other good arguments. Ilya Matvey makes the argument that till 2014, with the Crimea occupation, you could have logically described Russia as sub-imperialist, but then it became inter-imperialist. There are a lot of theorists out there who would like to see Russia and China as inter-imperial rivals, because it shows, in a sense, that the organic decline of an empire, the U.S. empire, is underway. We'd all probably appreciate the decline of the U.S. and its malevolent power, its military activities, and its power over economies, and so social and cultural and all sorts of factors. However, I regret, I don't think we're at that level where we can call China, even with a $240 billion a year military budget, anything like as powerful as the U.S. to qualify as inter-imperial. The U.S. has roughly $850 billion in, if you put all the pieces together, of annual spending on the military. They have more than 800 bases around the world, and China has only a couple. And if you look at the sort of mismatch between the imperial powers, it's hard to, even with Russia, with having very sophisticated long-range missiles, they say, it's difficult to put them in the same category as the U.S. But maybe more importantly, the sub-imperial layer, which I think I could call Russia still, implies deputy sheriff or regional gendarme duty. The dilemma is that they go rogue, and the U.S. has always had iron states that went rogue. You could think of Marcos in the Philippines, who had to be let go when there was social unrest, or Noriega in Panama. There are many cases where a dictator who had served U.S. interests then doesn't anymore. For Putin, he's sufficiently strong that he could be rogue in Crimea with the invasion in 2014 and then invade Ukraine in 2022. And his argument is partly that he was provoked. Of course, we know the argument about NATO expanding eastward, but also that the United States and Janet Yellen, the finance minister, the Treasury secretary, and all of the associated central banks and finance ministries who grabbed $650 billion of Russian assets, roughly half from the central bank, half from oligarchs, that they went rogue. In other words, if you're in imperialism, you play by certain rules, which are property rights and financial market rights are sacrosanct. So we're looking at a breakdown of all sorts of systems in which imperialism and sub-imperialism, in, as Marini put it, this cooperative antagonism in which they are in the same system, but they have somewhat different interests and ran out of control. And because you mentioned Samir Amin, and we've just had a very important celebration of his work in Rio de Janeiro with networks that include Progressive International, International Workers' People, what Samir thought was Fifth International would be a critical development from below. I'm not sure we're anywhere near the point where the World Social Forum should be resurrected. It was the major force for bringing progressives around the world, based in mostly Brazil and a little bit in other countries. And then we had a few other initiatives of a, let's say, less far-reaching sort over the last couple of decades. Progressive International may be one of the most important. There's a tricontinental project Vijay Prashad and his allies have. So there are very interesting projects out there that can do this linkage, but I think they're very divided. And for example, there is a group around Vijay and plenty of others who would appreciate the BRICS emerging now as a multipolar alternative to that unipolar U.S. And I think that's where it's critical to make the interventions where the data, the experiences, the politics should tell you that tyrants from the BRICS plus countries, because most of these, Iran, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Egypt, are tyrannies. And you combine that with their carbon addiction, they are not going to be a progressive, multipolar alternative to Western unipolar systems. And when you look at multilateral institutions and you see how closely the BRICS fit again and again, from the UNFCCC to financial arrangements, to trade, you don't find an anti-imperial multipolar alternative. You find sub-imperialism. It's in all those respects that I'm hoping that we get a lot more friendly debate among comrades to ask the tough questions. Who are your allies? What kind of social and class and environmental analysis are you bringing to bear if you, for some reason, think there's a multipolarism that's coming out of the likes of the BRICS plus? When what I think we all need, as Bill Fletcher, a U.S. labor and African-American leader, has said, we need a non-polar world. We need one in which the values of society and environmental survival are finally respected.
Well, I did want to ask you about how the Russian invasion of Ukraine is being perceived in South Africa. But before we get there, just one other theoretical question. Now that we're talking about, international norms. So many international legal scholars who have this third world approach, more of a Marxist approach to international law, would argue that concepts such as sovereignty, jurisdiction, the nation state, that they all come from a very specific European trajectory, which is bound up around industrialization and value extraction and capitalism. So it is a capitalist international legal order. So some of them would argue that you then, as a result of that, and because of colonialism and all the violence that it entailed, you would need different legal norms and different sort of bodies of law for so-called developing countries or weaker nations in order to sort of compensate for a lot of those disparities and power, unbalanced power relations. how would that play out? And do you think the BRICS would support those arguments?
Well, the dilemma is that property rights in Western law, going back to common law, have been the central force. In the mid-19th century, this was then codified in different constitutions, and South Africa was one where, regrettably, not only is property rights very core, but in 1996, when Cyril Ramaphosa, our current president, managed the constitutional process, they also gave corporations human rights, and they gave them sort of juristic personhood, as it's called. So the dilemma is that we get sucked deeper and deeper into those Western liberal norms, which are liberal politics, but neoliberal economics. And Samir Amin's great statement about the BRICS is that they will often argue with the geopolitical agenda of imperialism. They'll raise their concerns as leaders of this emerging markets. However, they will not challenge economic neoliberalism. So for Samir Amin, the BRICS could only walk on one of the two legs that are going to be required for doing something different. And I fear that's the case in a place like South Africa, where the power relations that made this country the second most unequal in the world at the time we were liberated from apartheid actually worsened on class lines, because we're now the most unequal because our inequality got much worse. So did poverty, so did unemployment. These all soared, and our ecological degradation has been extreme since 1994, with much liberalization of the mining sector and all sorts of, let's say, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, deregulatory processes. Now, that means I think you're a dilemma about, especially if you come from critical legal studies traditions, in which you're concerned that you can maybe take Western human rights norms and Western International Criminal Court, and maybe I will find some climate court at some point, and you try to overlay those onto a place like a South Africa. Well, you'll come up with incoherence, and that's what our own constitution has shown again and again, where we have very strong rights of people to healthcare, to housing, to education. And yet again and again, when we've seen these actually play out in the constitutional court at the top level, we've seen the politics from below squashed by orthodox legal thinking that rests upon two premises. One is that progressive realization of those rights is possible. You can just do a little bit more each year. And secondly, that you have to do it within available resources. And that means you go to the Treasury, and the Treasury is under the thumb of the IMF. Literally, we're engaged in structural adjustment and austerity that's brutally bad, including in the next month's budget. And in that sense, all our socioeconomic rights are just trumped. It's a bad verb, but works by the rights of property and the rights of neoliberal managers in the Treasury who say, no, there's just no money to give you the healthcare, the water, the housing that you're ostensibly guaranteed. So yeah, I would question whether our Western norms of liberal, let's say, constitutionalism, political parties that have certain kinds of capacities, but we're going to be only testing them when the ANC, the ruling party, loses sufficient power that it becomes competitive. And they may not work here. And I would say we need to transcend, we need to, in a sense, go through the sort of rights framework that has been given to us in our liberatory zeal in 1996 with this new constitution, and find much more concrete strategies. And we usually call these commoning. So if your water's disconnected, your electricity's disconnected, well, you'll find some comrades in the community who will come in and reconnect and do it illegally. And 85% of Soweto, the big township here in Johannesburg, is illegally connected to electricity because of informal electricians who then can get around the various metering systems. Same for water. Now, these are the, let's say, desperation tactics of mutual aid when a liberal economy and a liberal political system just doesn't deliver the goods. And I would love to see more of the other activists in the BRICS, like the movement of the landless workers in Brazil who occupy land, even if it's privately owned, who have basically the same kind of constraints. And their activists know that property rights and the liberal norms and values from the West only go so far when you are really genuinely desperate.
But is it accurate to say that these norms are already being applied unevenly or selectively? Because if you look at the U.S., for example, they're instituting more protectionist measures in certain contexts, for example, and they're de-risking with China and in the chip wars, so to speak. So it seems like, you know, there might be good reasons for them to do that, but would you say that they're already being selective with the application of these laws, while at the same time ensuring that WTO, World Trade Organization standards and trade standards are still being applied for everyone else?
Yes, that's right. And the need to get outside the WTO, we experienced in 2001. If you recall, there was a meeting in Doha, which came after the Seattle meltdown of the WTO. So they needed to re-legitimize that work for us, because the demand from South Africa, where we have out of about 60 million people, about 8 million who were living with HIV. At the time, it was around 5 million in 2001. And the medicines, the antiretroviral drugs, cost about $10,000 a year. So a very small sliver of the people who are living with HIV could get these medicines and live long, healthy lives with the ARVs. And as a result, there was a move to get intellectual property removed, as I mentioned, with COVID-19. And that was successful at the time. The balance of forces were much more in our favor. And what it did was allow generics to be made for the ARVs, and those were then rolled out through the public sector. And as a result, are mainly because of activists, the Treatment Action Campaign, really mobilizing the society, mobilizing the world community in solidarity. Those medicines for free, that used to cost $10,000 a year, allowed the life expectancy then to rise from a low of 52 in 2004 to 65 at the time of COVID. Now that's the kind of, let's say, commoning, in that case of intellectual property over medicines, that we could see as breakthroughs. So it's not impossible. It's a very rare case of actually going around the WTO restrictions, trade-related intellectual property restrictions. So what you're saying, I generally agree with, that there's been way too much emphasis on playing within those rules. Attempts to reform them, like we saw with Ramaphosa and Modi trying to get the exemption on COVID medicines, are very, very difficult. And the major reason, I think, is the U.S. has such a formidable, not only starting point, which is property rights, but also they bring a battery of lawyers and lobbyists, and their corporates are always extremely active, especially when they use diplomacy in the WTO to shout down any cheeky third world delegate. And I've seen that happen. It was a fantastic man from Uganda, Yash Tandon, who regularly, he's written about it in great detail, would try to challenge Western power within the WTO, and did so very successfully in Seattle in 1999. But at some point, if you do that, if you're in the UNFCCC like Pablo Solon or Seb Yanyo or Lumumba Diaping, three very famous negotiators from the South, each time the U.S. says to your president in your country, "Get that guy out of our face, take him off your delegation." So yeah, these are, let's say, symptoms of imperial power, and the WTO has worked with some glitches, but generally has worked very well. So it's a World Bank and IMF and the UNFCCC, as well as the imperialist vehicles. And regrettably, BRICS, sits into these institutions and systems as allies of the West rather than critics.
The very last BRICS summit in Johannesburg had an elephant who wasn't in the room, and that was Vladimir Putin, Russian president. He obviously wasn't able to attend because of the ICC warrant that's out against him. And there's been a lot of criticism of South Africa for not condemning the invasion outright. But, some people would argue that it's unfair to criticize countries because there's this international legal system and criminal system that's in place, which doesn't really work. I mean, the U.S. was never held to any sort of standards of accountability for its invasion, its unilateral, illegal, illegitimate invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan. So to then, hold Russia to that same standard is very hypocritical, given that the U.S. was never held to that standard. So how is, the perception of the war playing out in South Africa, at least from your perception of it?
Yeah, well, you're right exactly about this problem of hypocrisy at the International Criminal Court. I mean, Tony Blair, the Britain member, should have been prosecuted. The case of Brazil, also a member of ICC, Lula saying to Vladimir Putin, "Oh, you can come to the G20 when we host it next year," and then he's had to backtrack from that, reflecting that these are constitutional crises, because as we saw once here before in 2015, al-Bashir, the dictator from Sudan, was on that same ICC warrant and had to be sort of thrown out of the country very quickly before our own courts here in Johannesburg could quickly get that arrest warrant to comply with the ICC warrant. That was what we were expecting. So when Putin then decided not to come, just at the time when an African delegation led by Cyril Ramaphosa was visiting Moscow, he then signaled. And then Ramaphosa had to kind of go to the other BRICS leaders and say, well, he won't come, he'll send Sergei Lavrov. So you can imagine the chaos and, let me say, the distraction effect. It was compounded by two other factors, partly related to Ukraine. One was the war exercises that had been long planned with China and Russia, naval exercises in February on the 1-year anniversary. And a second factor had occurred in December, where the U.S. ambassador had claimed, and he said, I bet my life on it, so he might have had some CIA surveillance to give him that confidence. He said arms were uploaded to a ship that was snuck into the harbor in Cape Town, Simonstown. And that particular chaos, let's call it the Lady R, the name of the ship, the Lady R scandal, also has distracted us. Even still to this day, we don't know what really happened with that ship and what was being unloaded. Was it AK-47s to be used in Mozambique, as the defense minister implied, or were there other old ammunition stocks that were being brought back and forth with a private dealer? It's all very murky because we haven't got access to South Africa's report. The U.S. is trying to heal those wounds, and the main reason, the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, comes up for renewal, and South Africa is the main beneficiary, and it's mainly Mercedes-Benz, the German auto company, that gets huge tax benefits from being part of AGOA. The tariff rate for importing cars from South Africa to the U.S. is very low. Also, BHP Billiton, the biggest mining house in the world, with its steel and aluminum exports to the U.S., petrochemicals, some of the deep mining, the highest electricity guzzling products we have, I think should actually not be given this AGOA exemption. So they come into the U.S. and they're basically very cheap. And that's the big debate going on, even as we speak, over whether now the U.S. has let off the pressure. And unless Donald Trump wins in late 2024 and in 2025, when AGOA gets renewed, and he just says, no, I won't have South Africa in AGOA, you're getting too many benefits, which is quite likely if he does win, then this is one of those ways in which imperialism is trying to, let's say, smooth the rough edges with sub-imperialism in the U.S.-South Africa terrain. But you're absolutely right. The context is one in which geopolitically it's a very fluid situation. South Africa has initially condemned the invasion at the end of February, but then in early March, some say because the ruling party got a 10 million rand, or about a $500,000 contribution from a major oligarch, Victor Rexelberg, who co-owns a manganese a mine here. And that kept that ruling party's finances barely afloat. And those are the sorts of questions none of us really have clear answers to. What motivated that U-turn by South Africa then to be neutral, to say we won't condemn the invasion? Because the BRICS always rhetorically say we respect sovereignty, we respect international borders. And yet on this very clear occasion of the borders being violated, our president and foreign minister continually saying, no, we're going to play neutral, and that way we can be honest brokers. Is there a plausible case that South Africa could be part, perhaps with Lula in Brazil, perhaps with Erdogan in Turkey, of some delegation that finally settles a peace deal? It's not impossible. The plausibility comes from Cyril Ramaphosa having a role like that in Northern Ireland, actually where I was born, in Belfast, in trying to sort out what was called then the Good Friday Agreement. So this is why our politics are quite, let's say, hard to predict, because we don't quite know even whether Cyril Ramaphosa stays in power through the next election year, which is next year. He was threatening to resign apparently last December because of the financial scandal I mentioned. And the dilemma then is whether we can get social forces into play. And I should confess something I should have said at the outset. The position that I'm arguing is a lonely one on the South African left. And the reason is for lots of complicated, let's say, and diverse and in many cases corrupt reasons. The five major groups that we would say normally would represent the interests of the popular forces in our society, the five largest. One is a political party that gets 10% of the vote, Economic Freedom Fighters. Another is the rump of the ANC that's populist, called Radical Economic Transformation. A third is the South African Communist Party. A fourth is the largest trade union federation, the Congress of South African Trade Unions. And a fifth is the biggest single trade union, although it's not in COSATU. It's the National Union of Metalworkers. All five of these forces are not only pro-Putin openly and pro-BRICS openly, and they're now also pro-coal. So the kinds of protesters that we had in late August out against the BRICS were extremely, let me be humble and self-critical, a motley crew of environmentalists, community groups that are disaffected, of Kashmiris who are here in exile because they don't like what Modi is doing. We had Bangladeshis who didn't like what Sheikh Hasina, their leader, is doing. We had all manner of other, let's say, forces emerge, and they came largely to a field in Sandton, the financial district, about 4 kilometers away from the actual site of the summit. So we're hoping a BRICS from below network can show a more clear and firm and a more formidable force in the future. But at the moment, as I said, with the main center-left forces in our society quite explicitly pro-BRICS, with the lines of argument that my enemy's enemy is my friend when it comes to this hatred of U.S. imperialism, and with the sense that maybe Putin has some historic nostalgic relationship to the Soviet Union and its support for the anti-apartheid movement, even though we know Putin really was very, let's say, insulting of the USSR's traditions, especially Lenin. And in spite of very weak trade relationships between Russia and South Africa and the corruption in the nuclear deal, the role of the Wagner Group in Africa, all of these factors that should make our center-left forces more progressive and internationalist and supportive of the Ukrainian working class, we have failed to make the argument adequately to bring them to a kind of critical standpoint that I'm articulating.
Well, Patrick Bond, political economist, professor at the Sociology Department of the University of Johannesburg and director of the Center for Social Change. It was really great to have you on to discuss these issues, and I have a feeling we'll be speaking again very soon about social movements in South Africa and debt for climate, which I think are, very important issues. So it was a pleasure to have you on today.
Great to be with you, Talia, and with the Analysis Best Network, I see. Thanks.
Thank you. And thank you for watching theAnalysis.news. If you enjoyed this content, please don't hesitate to go to our website, theAnalysis.news, and hit the donate button at the top right corner of the screen. And we'll see you next time.